Afternoon, everyone. We'll get started as soon as I hear from Jed that we have a quorum.
Just got it, so we're ready to go.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Jed. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gina Midico with MnDOT Metro Planning, and I am the TAC Planning Chair. Given that we have a quorum, I will now call the June 12th, 2025 TAC Planning meeting to order.
Hi, Drew Flommer for Carver County. I'll make a motion to approve.
Okay, thanks, Drew. We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Charlie Howley, City of Chanhassen, will second.
Okay, thanks, Charlie. We have a motion and a second. This is a roll call vote, so when Jed calls your name, please indicate by saying aye. Go ahead,
Jorge
Jed.
Bernal, Anoka County. Mark Culver, Brooklyn Park. Drew Flommer, Carver County.
Aye.
Charlie Howley, Chanhassen.
Aye.
Scott Peters, Dakota County.
Abstain.
Dan Patterson, Hennepin County.
Aye.
Bridget Reef, Mac or alternate.
Zarek Gillis, aye.
Patrick Boylan, Council Community Development. David Burns, MTS.
Aye.
Patrick Haney, Metro Transit.
Aye.
Amy Barnsdorf, City of Minneapolis. Gina Midico, MnDOT.
Aye.
Innocent AO, Pollution Control Agency. Kevin Roggenbuck, Ramsey County.
This is Jennifer Jordan for Kevin. Aye.
Anton Jervy, St. Paul.
Aye.
John Rudolph, Scott County.
Aye.
Sunita Kasishwa, Suburban Transit.
Aye.
Elaine Katsukos, Tab Coordinator.
Aye.
Sarah Allen, Washington County.
Aye.
And Chris Hartzell, Woodbury.
Aye.
Chair, there were 14 ayes, no noes, and 1 abstention.
All right, thanks, Jed. The next item of business is any public comment on committee business. Jed, did anyone email with a request to make public comment?
No, there were no requests.
Okay, is anyone in the audience or online that would like to make public comment? Okay, seeing none, we will move on to the next item. And this is an action item or business item. It is the review of the Flying Cloud Airport 2040 Long-Term Comprehensive Plan. And Joe Whiting will lead us through that presentation. So I will turn it over to him.
Thank you, Chair Midico. We are back with more airport stuff. So I'm happy to join again. So as the chair mentioned, we are here today to begin our review of the Flying Cloud 2040 Long-Term Comprehensive Plan and its consistency review process for the plan itself. And so today we'll kind of go through the plan and some regional considerations, and then before we go to the action at the end. All right. So real quick, I'd like to remind everybody why we're here and what are the what's kind of requiring us to be here to review these airport long-term plans. And first here, so again, these live in Minnesota statutes, that's 473165 to 473611. So these are not federally mandated like our surface transportation systems in the region. This is a state mandated process. So the state mandates the council to both prepare a regional aviation plan, which is within the TPP, which we talked through last month, and also to ensure the aviation is included and considered in local comprehensive plans. So once we kick off our comprehensive planning process later this year, local communities will be considering these airport long-term plans and kind of in their land use considerations with potential noise impacts and compatibility like that as well. So why we're here today, though, is state statute also requires regional airports. So the 7 MAC airports and 2 city-owned, municipal-owned airports in the region to produce and update long-term comprehensive plans. The Met Council reviews and approves these airport comprehensive plans, or in the case of South St. Paul and Forest Lake, they're included within their community comprehensive plans with an expanded aviation element. The plan typically through this process, as the plan has gone through its public comment period, we at the staff level have provided some advisory technical comments. If you'd like to see what those look like, I can certainly let you know, but they're pretty minor, just more technical items here for the advisory for the MAC to consider as they finalize a plan through their own processes as well. So let's talk a bit about long-term comprehensive plans and kind of what they what they contain and what we review against. So again, these are required under state statute, and they're required under the aviation planning process as identified in the aviation system plan. These are 20-year planning documents. So this plan we are looking at today is a 2021 to 2041. It's called a 2040 plan, but because we don't want to call it 2041 plan, so it's the 2041. And so it's a regularly updated as scheduled in TPP. So the previous Flying Cloud long-term comprehensive plan was completed and approved in 2010. Update process kicked off in 2021, but it was delayed from additional FAA review for certain elements of the airfield improvements identified. But these plans are really used to identify needed projects, define operational parameters through the planning life, and to assess any environmental and financial requirements to be completed throughout the planning process for this plan. These plans must be consistent with Thrive MSP 2040. So I'm sure you're all aware we adopted Imagine 2050. I got my shirt underneath here in February. However, this plan was initiated and almost completely worked on and developed with Thrive as the lens of review for it. And so we were reviewing this one through the Thrive lens still. Future long-term comprehensive plans beyond this point will then be reviewed for consistency with Imagine 2050. So this will be kind of the last element of Thrive 2040 we'll be looking at for this process. So I mentioned these are also a basic input to the update of the aviation system plan, and also then used in local plan reviews when projects are developed in local planning. This plan has already been incorporated into the 2050 aviation system plan with the draft of this plan available, and so those numbers and things like that have been incorporated already into the update of the aviation system plan, which we will talk about again next month. Real quick, I just want to talk about the planning process that this plan went through over the last, again, 4 years now. So there's, as I mentioned, there's a delay due to additional needed FAA review of certain airfield improvement elements of the preferred alternative. So forecasts were developed all the way back in 2021. There's about a year delay or so with that FAA review, and so we should have been reviewing this about a year ago, but because of that delay, the FAA review, we're coming back here now. So that's why those operational forecasts kind of use 2021 as a baseline and only go to 2040. The plan outlines projected airport activity. So those are operations and also conceptual planned investments to meet the demand. So they forecast that demand through 2040 and then understand what kind of investments we need to make to meet that demand. It also inventories high-level environmental considerations and identifies future required environmental reviews, which are multiple identified projects in this plan, which will require either an environmental assessment or an environmental assessment worksheet following the adoption of this plan. So part of that aviation planning process includes a lot of different elements, but so we think about these airport long-term comprehensive plans similar to we think of a community plan, right? We don't directly address kind of environmental mitigation in the actual plan itself. That next step of the environmental review will kind of more deep dive into the analysis of the environmental impacts of the preferred alternative. So I mentioned public engagement was conducted throughout the process. So there was a stakeholder advisory panel, which was established with local and regional stakeholders, including council staff, local city staff, airport tenants, and anyone else potentially impacted by the airport plan. There's also a Flying Cloud Airport Advisory Committee, which meets regularly through the City of Eden Prairie, which was solicited as well, and also many public surveys and events and a public comment period, which I will talk about in detail in a little bit. Real quick, now as we move into the actual plan contents, we'll go the existing conditions of the plan itself. So Flying Cloud Airport, if you're not aware, is located in the Southwest Metro. I'll just pull the map up here just so you can see where that is. So Flying Cloud here in the south side of Eden Prairie, just north of Shakopee in the Minnesota River, situated there about 10 miles or so from MSP. The airport's classified as a national reliever on the federal system. It's a key general aviation airport on the state system, and it is a minor airport on the regional system. Its primary role is a secondary reliever at MSP. So the main reliever at MSP is downtown St. Paul, and Flying Cloud is then listed as a secondary reliever at MSP. Primary use is recreation flights, flight training, and also corporate and business jet activity. The size of the airport, it's about 540 acres. There's a 333 aircraft based at the airport in 2021, and the annual operations in 2021, which is our baseline, which I've used in 2021 here again, was 133,000 operations. So that's both takeoffs and landings. So if that helps you understand what an operation is, the runway lengths are about from the short end about 2,600 feet to the statutory limited 5,000 feet for that main runway. Has an instrument landing system and has a part-time air traffic control tower. When MAC kicked off this process, they identified 3 main goals that this plan should be meeting to aid in the regional system. First one is to enhance airport safety at the existing airport. And the second one is to preserve and, if possible, improve operational capabilities for the current family of aircraft using the airport, and also finally to promote financial sustainability of the MAC Relievers airport system with exploring revenue opportunities for aeronautical and non-aeronautical development within the airport boundaries. A big part of these plans, as I mentioned, was the activity forecast. So again, the planning period goes from 2021 to 2041. As we see here on this chart, we've actually seen quite a bit of drop, and a lot of regional airports in the country have seen kind of a general decline in activity over the last 20 or so years. However, and when you see here in 2020, whereas as opposed to MSP, where we saw big declines in activity, we actually saw big jumps in activity at airports like Flying Cloud, and we'll kind of talk about why that maybe is happening here. But beyond that, we're looking at a more steady kind of plateauing out and a steady growth throughout the planning period. Additionally, reliever airports also include projected aircraft based at the facility, as opposed to MSP, where we don't have those projections. But at our reliever airports, where based aircraft is a big driver of operations, that is also part of the forecasting for these airports. So by 2040, we're expecting about 143,000 yearly operations, which is about a 7% growth through the planning period. And connected to that, our based aircraft growth is about 354, or about 6% growth. Some details here about what's going on in these forecasts. So we actually see not a whole lot of growth and activity of those piston aircraft. Think of your propeller aircraft and things like that. A lot of the growth is being driven by jet activity at the airport. And the reason why that is Flying Cloud is projected to see the highest share of business and general aviation jet activity in the region. So by 2040, it's expected almost half of all corporate business jet activity will be taking place at Flying Cloud, which is a big difference from the past, where generally a lot of that activity is taking place in downtown St. Paul. But as that has shifted now a little bit towards Flying Cloud, and we'll kind of talk briefly about why that is happening. But that growth in jet operations, as you can see here in the forecast base aircraft table, is really driving what's going on at the airport in the future. As you see that jet aircraft share of based aircraft increase with that increase in kind of importance of this airport for that sort of activities in the region. So some of the factors shaping these forecasts, as I mentioned, the big one here, especially if you think about regional jet activity at the airport, is location, right? Location. So increasing regional share of business jet traffic is really driven by where the airport is. So as I mentioned, it's that Southwest Metro. So it's located in the Southwest suburbs, where there's a large concentration of corporate AQs, large business units are located down there. And also another one is where corporate executive housing, usually those high-level corporate execs are generally on the western side in those southwestern suburbs. If they're going to be using business jets to fly around the country, they're not as likely to fly into St. Paul and drive all the way home. They're going to try and fly as close as they can to their homes and their businesses. And so you're seeing a lot of that location-based activity really driving kind of the interest for regional jet activity to Flying Cloud itself. Another big aspect of these forecasts as well too is flight training. So if you notice it in those, as I mentioned, in those activity historic activity numbers where you see the 2020 jump in activity. Well, there's a third flight training school which began operations at the airport in 2020. So kind of tied to that year 2020, we see that big jump in activity. But also we see with COVID as well, a lot of pilots in the mainline corporate aircraft world and commercial aircraft world that were retiring because of those drop in operations. So we really see a pretty severe and ongoing pilot shortages, which we anticipate to continue to drive that need and growth for pilot training at this airport, at any other regional airports in the region as well that have those facilities for the foreseeable future, to kind of backfill that growing gap in the airline pilots existence. And also finally, another key factor shaping these forecasts are airfield improvements. So we'll see here when we go to the next slide, there's going to be a lot more development area opened up from some of these projects coming up. And so what that'll do is that'll drive more aircraft actually using the airfield, specifically those jet aircraft. And then also we'll see additional taxiways to kind of improve the operational efficiency of the facility, and also additional safety improvements to the main runway, which will help pilots utilizing that runway to feel safe and comfortable actually using the runway. So something called Engineered Material Arresting System, or an EMAS bed, are planned to be installed on the main runway. So that's 10R28L, which will allow the full and safest use of that main runway for the most demanding aircraft types, so those corporate and business jet activity at the airport. And we'll see what that looks like in a second here. So we're looking at here the preferred alternative. So the preferred alternative is split into phases. That first phase, which is near term 1 to 5 years, that midterm 6 to 10, and then that long term, which would be 10 plus years out. The near term, we're looking at so a lot of different projects here. I'll just kind of outline some of the major projects that maybe have impacts to the surrounding community or other systems. So the near term, we do see a new altered access to Pioneer Trail, which is Hennepin County Road, and that will require obviously Hennepin County coordination with that new access. They're looking to relocate the air traffic control tower. You can't see it on the map here, but it'll be moving from down here, kind of the south end of the runway, to closer to the runway to improve that visibility. What that means then is these hangars here on the south end will then be able to develop out as before they couldn't necessarily develop because there's visibility issues if they're fully developed with those runways. So once that tower is moved, that'll open up a lot of potential new development activity at the airport itself. We see those EMAS beds on either end of the main runway, those yellow boxes, and number 1 and 2. Those will again help unlock the full and safest use of that main runway for those most demanding aircraft at the airport today. And we see some new taxiways again to kind of improve how airplanes get around the airport as well, to improve those operational efficiencies. The medium term, we see a continued taxi development. We see here project number 9, we're starting to see some potential park impacts with the adjacent park facilities here. That these park facilities are on the airport property, and so these are up, working with the city of Eden Prairie. Any mitigation will be needed to do here will be worked with the city, and also will help to work with the proposed improvements. Additionally, there's also a ground run-up enclosure here, number 12. What those are really is those help when you're doing routine maintenance activities on jet aircraft. They got to do engine run-ups, which are very loud, and so these ground run-up enclosures help to reduce those noise impacts from those routine operations that will be taking place with jet aircraft. The long term, we see here then that southern hangar area starts to see that full build out, and those would be mostly operated towards jet aircraft. As those more jet aircraft start basing at this airport, you'll see some of that build out of those southern hangars. And then you also see some northern hangar development as well in the long term. So the long term, 10 plus years, will probably be at another planning process before we start seeing a lot of these longer term projects come in. But these are definitely to get you an idea of how that full build of the runway will look, to get an understanding of how that will work together. Looking at the whole preferred alternative here, and with our development costs here, so it's estimated in current dollars that all these project improvements will be about $134 million over the life of the plan. However, I make it clear these are current dollars, so likely as you see these become a move in the CIP in future years, when they after the environmental review period, you'll probably see some cost escalation just from building material escalation and various inflation escalation as well. But this $134 million gives you an idea of kind of the scope of these improvements at the airport over the next 20 years. The plan also includes a discussion and consideration of environmental factors. The main one really here is aircraft noise. So aircraft noise is really the main, I think, complaint you hear from a lot of airports, right? People living next to the airport, they hear a lot of aircraft noise, and it can be an annoyance to them. And so the FAA has developed guidance with MAC, and the council has followed with in developing our kind of mitigation strategies to update what were called noise contours or the impacts to surrounding communities from aircraft operations. And this is updated with the long-term comprehensive plans for relief airports. At MSP, those are updated annually. Noise impacts are measured by something called the day-night average sound level, or DNL. So this is the main metric with which to measure land use compatibility for surrounding airports. And so we'll see what that looks like in a second here, but these measures reflect a person's cumulative exposure to sound over a 24-hour period. So it's not necessarily one event, you know, an airplane flying over your house. It might be higher than what you see in some of these cumulative impacts, but this is really thinking about, you know, cumulatively every day, what are you expecting to hear those sound impacts around an airport? And I like this little graph here. It just kind of shows, it gives you an idea of kind of what we're talking about here with decibels. So an aircraft like a Cessna, which you see a lot at a regional airport like Flying Cloud, your decibel levels are very similar actually to a vacuum cleaner or a car moving on a highway, you know, nearby you. So people like to, you know, think of aircraft noise as maybe something different as everyday noise you hear, but really it's really pretty similar to kind of what you experience in your day-to-day life, with obviously big greater peaks and valleys from, you know, those operations are a little more spread out throughout the day. First, we'll look at the comparison here. So this is the first, these are the noise contours here that were developed for the plan. And so we got our DNL lines. So essentially the FAA talks about 65 DNL as that threshold for land use compatibility issues, especially with residential land uses. And we see here, even if our growth, our base year 2021 in blue and our 2040 noise contour here. So the worst impacts at 65 DNL do not leave airport property, and we're not expecting them to. And those 60 DNL line here you see here is more kind of advisory as those kind of start to creep out. You know, thinking about extra soundproofing and developments if you're building a new house or something like that, if you're within that contour line, but it's nothing that is required through federal processes. As you can see here, even that 60 DNL line barely leaves that airport property, and we'll see what that looks like here in a second. When you compare that with the actual existing land use around the airport, you see that 60 DNL line touching a few residential areas beyond the airport, but generally, again, that the 65 DNL line is completely within airport property. We do not expect major impacts from these sound impacts through 2040 for adjacent residential uses. Additionally, the noise, which gets a lot more focus, there's also other environmental impacts considered in these plans. As I mentioned, these are high-level comprehensive plans similar to your city plans, so they're not really analyzing these in depth, but they are inventorying them and then getting ready for that next environmental review period, which will follow the adoption of this plan. So these are included in potential impacts of both the natural environment and the surrounding environment. These are inventory but not studied in depth. And then when we think about that, we move on to that environmental review period, whether that's an EA or EAW or both. You know, be looking at water quality, stormwater, solid waste, wastewater, air quality issues with the preferred alternative, which will be, again, following the process that we will be going through here. As I mentioned in the beginning of this, MAC has a pretty robust public engagement process for these plans. It's gotten pretty good. It's like clockwork kind of going through these. Engagement meetings were held to date from 2022 to 2025. There may be additional ones beyond today, so that's why we're saying to date here. But so we've had many meetings throughout the process here. So again, MAC has their own planning development environmental committee, which meets monthly. They met with them and consulted with that group at 3 times for this process. That stakeholder advisory panel that was created with regional stakeholders had 5 meetings, again, soliciting feedback throughout the process. MAC also held 4 public events known as Discover Flying Cloud public events throughout the process for those 3 years. Additionally, there's a standing Flying Cloud Airport Advisory Committee, which they met with twice through this process, again, soliciting more feedback. As I mentioned, there's that 45-day public comment period was held from February 19th to April 5th. They received 22 total comments, 4 around facilities, 1 around communications, 2 around environmental considerations, and 15 around aircraft noise. As mentioned, that's kind of the biggest thing you think about the airport. So the majority of these comments were revolved around that noise impact. And as I mentioned earlier, Met Council staff provided some technical advisory comments as well during the public comment period for MAC. Before we finish this off, we'll talk a little bit about relationship to regional policy. So as I mentioned, Flying Cloud down there in the southwest suburbs. As a long-term comprehensive plan used a basic input to council plans and policies, we have incorporated the plan into our TPP update. Relationship to the transportation policy plan, Flying Cloud is classified as a minor airport in the system. This plan will not change that role in the system. Again, it's minor airfield improvements, improve efficiency and safety, and build out of those facilities at the airport. So there's no significant airside improvements that would change the role. Certain projects, again, may require coordination with other jurisdictions to mitigate impacts, like connecting into Hennepin County roadway. However, these are not regional in nature and don't necessarily impact the relationship to the transportation policy plan. The long-term comprehensive plan addresses the required elements from the aviation system plan, and it meets the regional development guide. So the policy direction is to create consistent, compatible, and coordinated local comp plans, which this planning process is doing. And also this plan really goes to meet that prosperity outcome that was identified again in the 2040 2040 regional development guide. So advancing this outcome is to plan and invest in infrastructure, amenities, and quality of life for regional economic competitiveness. As we looked at those activity forecasts, Flying Cloud Airport is anticipated to become the main hub of businesses and corporate jet activity in the region, and improving this airport and making sure it can accommodate these aircraft is definitely really meeting that economic competitiveness of the region, especially think about those larger corporate presence in the Southwest Metro. This plan will support that expected growth and ensure the airport can handle what is coming. So looking ahead, so as I mentioned, we've kind of gone through a pretty robust engagement process throughout to the point we're at now. So now we're at the point where we're at the Met Council review, where Met Council reviews and provides consistency review determination, which is beginning today at the TAC planning level. Follow that, MAC determines any project funding from available funding sources after adoption. They then move into that required environmental review period, which we tentatively have heard is beginning in 2027. So that'll be following the adoption of the plan, and then finally moving on to putting these projects in the capital improvement plan and then construction in the future. Before I get to this, I was like, note there is one item that we do not have as a attachment today, and that is the full detailed stakeholder engagement process that will be coming likely in the next week or two. So I'll update everyone with that additional document when that is ready. But I did want to include that just on as an item that will be included for your review. With that said, I will open up to any questions or comments before we go into the recommended motion, though. And I'll open up the floor. And I also note too, before we do that, Eric is here as well. So if you have any very specific questions about airport operations or anything like that, he is here to help out with any questions. So thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Any questions or comments from committee members? Charlie.
You, Madam Chair. Joe, nice presentation. 2 questions. First, your data about the number of takeoffs and landings or whatever, it was 2021, I believe. And then you had a forecast showing, that it plateaus off or whatever. I look at my calendar, it's June of 25. Why isn't that blue line like showing through 24? Why don't we have more actual numbers? Just curious.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. And Eric, if you want to follow up on this, you can. So I was through the planning process. So the forecasting is kind of done in the early ends, as your forecasts are going to drive how you design your facilities for the future. And so forecasting was done in 2021. So that's why you see that baseline of 2021. And one of the things that delayed this process was a required FAA review during the development of the airport plan, so that kind of preferred alternative we see, and that slowed it down pretty significantly. So without that, we would probably have reviewed this sooner, and that 2021 might have been less of an obvious kind of why are we not seeing that further activity. But so that's kind of why we see that delay here is that FAA review, which Eric, if you want to expand upon that a little more, I know it was a pretty time consuming process that delayed this quite a bit, but that's the main reason why we don't see a more recent kind of existing baseline for this process.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Madam Chair, members, appreciate the opportunity to speak about the long-term plan today. So the reason why it stays where it is the FAA has approval authority on the aviation activity forecast. And so once we obtain that approval, the baseline itself, at least for aviation activity forecasting, stays relatively static. We do monitor it though, in terms of actuals, but generally speaking, the forecasted growth that we're seeing, which is about 0.4% compounded annually year over year, generally is following what the FAA's forecast is, called the Terminal Area Forecast, or TAF for short. So once we get that approval, even during the long-term plan process, we do continue to monitor and coordinate with the FAA to ensure that, we're not consistently updating the baseline through the long-term plan, because that could be laborsome and tedious for the FAA to review and update it. But we do obtain kind of that general concurrence after we get our initial approval. And to Joe's point, he kind of brought it up in a couple of different manners during the presentation. We did have a little bit longer planning review process because of some additional coordination with the FAA. So perhaps that's why the original baseline looks a little bit older than it is, but we do continue to monitor it as after it's been already approved.
And yeah, thanks, Eric. And I just follow up too, like, and I would say too, like looking at, we do have more recent activity data, and it's pretty in line with, I think, what we'd expect. And so in the case of something we wouldn't expect, like, so for MSP, for instance, because of COVID happened kind of in the middle of that process, those forecasts were updated considering that, but because it was such a large deviation and change in the forecast, that kind of required that. But because, Eric, right, because we haven't seen much of a change from what we expected, it's still pretty in line with what we're expecting. And so that update isn't as necessary as, say, with MSP with the COVID impacts.
Correct. And then one other thing of note to mention, future plan development from the long-term plan is not largely based on aviation activity forecast. We do use forecasting for based aircraft demand in regard to showing future hangar growth over the next 20 years, but that's kind of the limit of what we use for forecasting. So when you look at taxiway realignments, potential runway improvements, that's largely based on 10 years of historical aviation activity. So kind of the actuals versus the forecast. So we do monitor forecasting, but it doesn't really swing the barometer either direction really in terms of a lot of the potential physical infrastructure you may see outside of kind of that hangar growth demand piece.
Cool. Thank you. My second question, Joe, on a little later slide, it was the public outreach, and you had like stakeholder meetings and advisory committee meetings. Just curious, which of these groups is the City of Eden Prairie part of?
Good question. So the Flying Cloud Airport Advisory Committee is, correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, but it is kind of nested within the Eden Prairie city government structure. At least it lives on their website, and they take place in City Hall. But additionally to that, the Stakeholder Advisory Panel also included Eden Prairie staff as well, I believe, correct?
Yep, that is correct. And we actually also have Michelle, our Director of Stakeholder Engagement, on with the MAC. Maybe she wants to add a little flavor to this question.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Madam Chair, or Chair and members. We do work very closely with the City of Eden Prairie through the Flying Cloud Airport Advisory Commission. It is a committee that's part of their city council, or a subcommittee of their city council. We attend those regularly, even outside of the long-term planning process. So we continue to coordinate with them and keep them updated on airport issues that are ongoing, or just questions and operational numbers. Just keep them updated. But they did participate, or invited to participate, in the stakeholder advisory panel, as well as all the public events as well.
Awesome. Thank you.
Any additional questions or comments?
You looking for a motion?
I would look for a motion, yes, if we are. Yeah.
I can supply a motion.
All right.
It's like a bad 70s disco song. So motion.
Okay, and is that the recommended motion, which would be to the TAC and tab that the Metropolitan Council will find that
Yes.
Draft Flying Cloud Airport 2040 LTCP has multi-city impact as well as conforms to the regional systems and is consistent with regional policies. Do we have a second?
Sure thing. That'd be Drew again.
All right, thanks, Drew. Any additional discussion from the committee? All right, seeing none, we will go ahead and ask Judd to take the roll. Those in favor of the motion indicate by saying aye. Thanks.
Jorge Bernal, Anoka County. Mark Culver, Brooklyn Park. Drew Flommer, Carver County.
Aye.
Charlie Howley, Chanhassen.
Aye.
Scott Peters, Dakota County.
Aye.
Dan Patterson, Hennepin County.
Aye.
Eric Gillis, Mac.
Aye.
Patrick Boylan, Community Development.
Aye.
Dave Burns, MTS.
Aye.
Patrick Haney, Metro Transit.
Aye.
Amy Barnsdorf, City of Minneapolis. Gina Medico, MnDOT.
Aye.
Innocent AO, Pollution Control Agency. Jennifer Jordan, Ramsey County.
Aye.
Anton Jervy, City of St. Paul.
Aye.
John Rudolph, Scott County.
Aye.
Sunita Kasishwa, Suburban Transit.
Aye.
Helene Katsukos, TAP Coordinator.
Aye.
Sarah Allen, Washington County.
Aye.
Chris Hartzell, City of Woodbury.
Aye.
Chair, there were 17 ayes, no noes, and no abstentions.
All right, thanks, Jed. The next item is an information item. It is one that we had a preliminary discussion of last month. It is regarding the 2026 Unified Planning Work Program, also known as the UPWP, the consultant study review. I didn't see a presentation on the agenda. And it looks like we've got Bethany, Jed, and Amy here to discuss. So I will kick it over to you all and see how you want to walk through it.
Thank you, Chair. I will start. My name is Bethany Brandt. I am a planner here at the council, and together with Jed and Amy, I am working on the 2026 Unified Planning Work Program. And last month, Jed gave you a presentation on the studies that are in the 2025 UPWP, a preview of some ideas for the 2026 UPWP. And since that meeting, we've met with a few partners to understand their priorities for this work. And so we're back today to just give you an update on the direction we're headed. And then next month, we will be back to recommend a release for public comment. So we have a few key questions here, and they're roughly the same as last month, but if there's anything that you are seeing that is missing out of the UPWP and you'd like us to review and consider, are there any system studies that have not been identified, and whether the proposed project descriptions seem appropriate for what we are trying to accomplish with this work. So just with the posting, there are 2 attachments, and given the new federal priorities, we have elected to split out our project addendums into a federally funded addendum and a locally funded version. The locally funded ensures that we can continue to advance some of our TPP priorities that are state directed, and that may not be supported at a federal level. The federally funded project descriptions is what we will be using federal funds to complete to advance the priorities in the TPP. So those 2 documents are attached and each page within these attachments includes an overview, the key tasks, the schedule and budget, and the proposed staff contact. So within these 2 documents, you might notice that we removed 3 studies from consideration in 2026. They're largely due to just a lack of scoping. We're not quite there in understanding what the intended outcome of that project would be or how we would use it, or we need to finish some studies in advance before we start these new studies. So these 3 studies here, the greenhouse gas reduction strategy development, the highway system optimization study, and an arterial modernization study, it is likely that these would come forward in the future in some fashion once a more defined scope can be created. The projects that have moved from the 2025 UPWP using federal funds into the local funds is some community considerations training based on the equity framework project that Amy had been working on, the EV public charging needs analysis that is getting under contract this year, and some public engagement and city technical support. And then based on the feedback that we got from the last meeting and our partners, we have added 4 new studies that show up in the UPWP across the federal and locally funded. So that is a Complete Streets Local Implementation Guide, a Comprehensive Planning Technical Assistance, and we'll be using both federal and local funds for that project. We'll be partnering with MnDOT on a managed lane vision and system study update, and we'll be working on an existing interchange modernization study. So I'm going to pause here and ask if there are any questions, comments, concerns on the proposed work. Otherwise, we'll talk about some next steps.
Thanks, Bethany. Any questions? I do have one if nobody else is jumping to ask or make a comment. Can you remind me, you have the greenhouse gas reduction strategy development as one that will be kind of paused and maybe developed at a future date. Can you remind me what that was going to entail? And just maybe what it was and what we needed to further develop before moving that forward.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, for that question. I'm hoping maybe Tony can pop on if he is still here to discuss that project.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So I think the vision with that project was to do some scenario planning work, sort through different GHG reduction strategies in terms of reduction potential, costs, co-benefits, things like that, and just try to, create that information for us and our partners for, where to start and where to focus our attention.
I think to add on to that, some of the work that we are doing in the comprehensive planning technical assistance will be a good groundwork in helping to identify what the reduction strategy development will need to pick up. So I think we can do some building on the work that we've included this UPWP to set us up well for the greenhouse gas study in the future.
Okay, so that piece is still moving forward. That piece you're referring to the technical guidance for the comp plan updates?
Correct, yes.
Okay, because that was one of my questions, if that would delay that or affect how we get information out or resources on the comp plan updates. Okay, so it sounds like they're separate and that one would lead to the other, if I understand correctly.
That is the
intent. One will inform the other,
Yes.
The correct way. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
Okay, so our next steps, the MTS staffers will continue to review the UPWP content and these project descriptions. We'll be bringing back to the July meeting the full UPWP document that will include the document that you typically see, and we'll release that for public comment that will start on July 11th. And then it will go to TAC to review and recommend NTAB in August, ending up at the council in September for final approval. And that is all I have today, unless there are any other questions or comments.
Thanks, Bethany. Not seeing any hands yet, but I'll pause.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, looking back at the agenda, that was the last official information item. Do we have any other items, or does anyone have any other business that they would like to mention at the committee level? All right, seeing none, then I will go ahead and adjourn the meeting, and we will see you all in July. Thank you.
Thank you.